chief. And Nanangabe, his relative, was one of those guys who never would go to a French settlement. He wanted to live out in the wilderness. And he was eventually, in 1856, he was killed by a Dakota Indian who happened to be, this is where history gets really interesting, happened to be his nephew, was a Dakota Indian. Figure that one out. His father, Nanangabe's father, was Cake. And he was also known as Yellowhead. And that had, you know, when you hear a name, you have to figure out why they got named like that. But that had to do with a dream, as Paul described. And Cake was a headman. His son, Nanangabe, inherited that role, but yet Nanangabe was a terrific warrior. And he also had lots of knowledge of healing herbs from the wilderness. And so Nanangabe was a man of the wild. Kawinze was a man of the fort. And we actually did have a fort down there, so that's why I say he was a hang around the fort. Yeah, because he lived real close to the fort. And so we actually had a stockade there at one time, and so that's why they kind of say that about him. But on the other hand, he was an incredible warrior and a great hunter, and he really had knowledge of medicines. So he was a spiritual leader as well, and oftentimes, okay. What we're going to do now is, let's see if I can close this up. Some of these things I've mentioned before. This is Nanangabe. And again, I'm really happy because my wife is a direct descendant of Nanangabe. So are, you know, a couple thousand other people from our reservation. So I guess I should. Okay. That sort of means end of the road.
Thank you very much. A great insight for all of us. And just a perspective that we don't often get when we're reading through the books, and so we really appreciate your presence here. And we have a little bit of time. Are there burning questions? Because we also have some time to get some things to eat and drink. And
when you mentioned the French came with the Anishinaabe, what was the value of the beaver for the Anishinaabe other than trading with the French?
I'm going to repeat the question. That's a great question. What was the value of the beaver for the Anishinaabe other than trading with the French?
You know, there was quite an industry, and voyagers, you know, moved back and forth across this lake and also down Huron, and they just moved those beaver hides in packs. You know, if you go up to Grand Portage, you can see examples of that up there. They moved huge packs in 40-foot long birch bark canoes and go up and down the Great Lakes, and they had to brave the storms on the lakes and you know, the weather and just a host of other things. Beaver could also be used as a survival product for the Ojibwe. I mentioned that the Ojibwe had to spread out. They needed clothing in the wintertime, and they really needed those hides. Back in the 17th century, 18th century, there were moose, there were elk, cougars, I mean, there were wolves, there were everything here in northern Wisconsin. And so the elk hides and you know, the moose hides were of great value, but also take into account those huge pine trees which blocked out the sun. So that's why the Ojibwe people had to be very selective in the places that they chose to move to. Beaver hives were very important in a number of ways, and it's a good question, thank you.
Sir,
William Warren describes what sounds like kind of a mass exodus of Ojibwe from Madeline Island, probably late 1700s. He gives a couple of possible explanations. Is there anything known about that?
Moratorium, the moratorium on
so
trade.
the question was about the mass exodus that William Warren describes in the mid
Late 1700s.
Late
17, before his grandparents, maternal grandparents came here.
Mhm. Yeah. One was that French moratorium on fur trade west of Montreal. And that caused a mass exodus up the rivers, going up into the inlands of northern Wisconsin and parts of Michigan, off of the lake. For the first time, you didn't have these, select hunting parties, going in here and there. Now you had literally dozens of people flooding down into the northern, even though we had these pine trees that were blocking out. They were looking for the burn areas where there was deciduous, because where you found the deciduous, you found white-tailed deer and elk and other animals they could get.
Yeah, I was kind of confused about the moratorium too, because was it in an area back near Montreal?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so they could hunt
West.
out here.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. Yes.
So you
So
describe
just
how,
stand up and
Oh,
see if
sure.
you can project, so I don't have to.
so you describe how when the Anishinaabe first came here and the massive white pines on the island
Yeah.
made it impossible for deer hunting and other cultivation. What was it about the island though that made them want to come here in the summers and have it be a gathering place?
Well, I think
Especially-
initially it represented protection, for one thing, from the enemy tribes. And in another, you could fish along the lake. Because, you couldn't, we really needed those fur, those hides, for warmth. That was essential. And Ojibwe economic life was all about survival. It's about gathering and hunting and fishing and firewood and, where you had huge pine trees that we've described, with a diameter from here to you, blocking out the sun, it really created a quandary for the tribes. So they had to spread out. They had to really seek these places where they could find some limited food and also clothing and warmth. We all know how brutal the winters are out here. And it's, that's one of the facts of life in this area.
Some of us are still summer people.
I understand that there's Better Mashkabishi tribal lands on Madeline Island, and I'm just curious, why was not Madeline Island actually made part of a reservation when the treaties were signed, and why were the Better people relocated over to Gitgabig, where Mashkabishi is now? And then I understand that Chief Buffalo he had somewhat of a settlement going, and he was allocated those lands there. I'm just wondering why Madeline Island wasn't part of either of those two pieces.
Okay, I'm going to try to repeat the question, which is basically, why wasn't Madeline Island part of the reservations that were created in the Treaty of 1854?
Yeah, given its importance for that you stated.
The Bad River, that comes down from the heights, is a big alluvial plain, and it's also a wild rice bed. And it had, it didn't have as many pine trees. So it represented, some security in finding food and warmth and some of those other things, and growing. And the missionaries were encouraging the tribes to, leave these regions. And I don't think Madeline Island was that big a force. There were some people living there, there's no question. Ojibwe here, yes, there were. But it wasn't in the numbers that we think about, in the hundreds or the thousands, as we were often told. And so the missionaries had a big influence, and then when the Treaty of 1854 was, that negotiation was held right here at La Pointe in late summer or September of 54.